This week is something a little different. Instead of doing my typical Skype interview with people, I'm doing a little face-to-face with Dean Berlinerblau. We did it at a meeting room at a local library. So this time you're going to be hearing a live chat between me and Dean with a little Zoom recorder. I hope you enjoy. Okay, today I am getting a chance to meet face-to-face with somebody new. His name's Dean Berlinerblau, and he got in touch with me because of a project that he's involved in, which I'm sure he'll talk about. But as I dug into where he's coming from, he's got a pretty interesting background, and so I thought it would be perfect for to kick off a podcast with him. We're also going to be covering some of this work at Cycling 74 and some other stuff, but I thought it would be great to hear his voice and to kick things off with this podcast. So with that, I will say hello to Dean. Hey, man, how's it going?
Good, Darwin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for hopping in a car and coming down. Like I said, it seems really hard to get people away from the cities and to come down into farm country here, so I really appreciate it. So why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about the work that you do?
I have a solo experimental electronic project called Modify. I've been working at this for about 3 years now, and it's grown with me over time in that it's been the outlet, it's been the ultimate manifestation of my individuality. I've learned a lot with it, and it's very much a reflection of what I've realized with my individual growth, and everything that I've learned about myself and that I've learned about the world gets poured into this work that I do. So in August, I released an album, my first album, under the moniker Modify, which in the past I did more minimal synth type stuff, starting about a little over 3 years ago. And the spelling was just MDFY. And then I played some shows with that over the course of 3 years. And then I discovered the whole world of processing and digitally processing audio using software tools. I grew a lot personally and gained a huge interest in psychology and various domains of philosophy. And all of these different interests kind of all lined up. And because of that, I started discovering a lot of new ways to approach my work. And with Transformational Variances, I really wanted to tell a story about the different aspects of what it means to be in the world. I would say the album is kind of separated into I would say 4 parts. And the first part of it is this dark confrontation of chaos, understanding what you don't know and understanding the complexity of everything that the world is throwing at you. And then it kind of goes into this growth of it's like a 15-minute archetypal growth of what to do with that chaos that's confronted. And that's the 4th track, Energy Towards a Working State of Growth, which I used a sample of my nephew's heartbeat before he was born to represent what it means to be bare and what it means to be introduced to this world and to confront everything that the world throws at you, and to climb this ladder of higher being faster than you fall down the inevitable hole of what it means to live. That song is very much more positive in my eyes. It's the whole basis of this thing is predicated on the philosophy of chaos and order, and a profound influence on this album and on me as an individual was the psychology professor Jordan Peterson, who teaches at the University of Toronto. He came up with this philosophy about the world and about being itself, this philosophy of chaos and order, that chaos is everything we don't know and everything that we have to confront, and order is everything that we know. Order is what the world likes. Order is what keeps us sane. But chaos is what we don't know yet, and chaos is creativity. There was one particular time when I was on the spear hiking trail, camping with a couple friends. So I had these poles that I had to maneuver around this muddy spot, and I was like, this is chaos. And then when I'm walking on a well-trodden, perfect path, I tend to use the 2 poles in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
to walk it, and that's order. And I told my friends about that, and they too are very familiar with Peterson's work, and they were like, yes, that makes sense. And then I think about this constantly in the world. Carl Jung has this idea of the tension of opposites, where everything about you that is not consciously acted out will be made up unconsciously. And I think that is true about the world at large, that we're always living on this spectrum of opposites. And I think about that every day of my life. Well, if I'm not confronting some problem now, it'll rear its ugly head later. Or if I'm doing something that's really good for me now, then it'll probably yield future reward, or it might.
It's really interesting. I have to say that I've heard a lot of people who have a lot of different perspectives and reasons for getting into composing music, but not a lot of them embrace, a combination of philosophy and psychology in their work. What is it that caused you to do that? I mean, let's face it, a lot of times electronic music, it's really easy to say, well, I went to a party and I had a good time and I made some music. Obviously, you took a different approach to the whole musical thing. What is it that drove you to get into music making in the first place? And what is it that drives you to kind of latch on to that as the design behind your process?
Well, I think that music itself is always expanding the boundaries of what we know. So I've always been interested in that. I've always been interested in expanding the order and like hanging out with all of these weird people who are interested in doing the same thing. Like for some reason, all the stars aligned where we're all at this show right now, or we're all at this meetup. We're all at whatever situation that gathers all these strange people together. I really appreciate not only the community aspect of it, but most of all the individual aspect of what it means to express yourself musically. I see it as a language that everyone can speak. It's spiritual, whether completely consciously or unconsciously. It's very rare to find someone who doesn't like some sort of music.
Right.
And I think, as I was saying earlier, my work has evolved with me over time. So everything that I've done at a specific time has reflected who I was at that time. And for that reason, I think the biggest artistic challenge, at least for me, is to like what you're doing always at the time. Because with this, with this type of work, with what I was doing for Transformational Variances, I eventually I just got so sick of working on it. Like it was just endless iterations, like V6, V7, V8, up to
Right.
V16,
Yeah.
and then eventually this could go in so many other directions. And at some point, you kind of just need to let it go, and you need to let it grow with you. And if you're at some point growing out of it, or feel like the world needs to see that representation of yourself at that particular time, I think it's good to just release it. And eventually I just let it go and gave it to the guy who mastered the album, Adam Tucker, and he had his own perspectives on it. And throughout the process of the album, I also got perspectives and critique from good friends that I trust musically, and I think that's also very important, to let you to let you know that you're still sane.
Yeah, that what you're doing is making a mark. Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And I don't know, one of the things I notice is that a lot of times really productive musical people actually work in pairs. There's something about that. There's something about having a second person to bounce ideas off. It means that you don't have to get too much consensus, but it also means that you're not like off in a corner beating yourself up over version 45. It gives you the ability to know when to sort of like pull out of the dive. For you, what was it that eventually allowed you to say, okay, this is what has to go out the door? Because it's a hard thing for everyone. I mean, one of the things, I've talked to a number of people on my podcast, and I've talked specifically about how do you know when you're done? How do you know when it's over? How do you know when it's good enough to ship? Or when it's the statement you want to make? And for you, what was the turning point?
Well, I've gone through that in a lot of different iterations with different bands that I've been in. I was in many bands in Duluth over the past 5 years. But with this album, and any of my individual work in general, I think it needs to be an honest representation of who I am at the time. So I find it appropriate to release once you really feel like it's a part of you, and it's because it just doesn't feel right to release something once you've grown out of it. So, and I also think, I'm very much focused on the internal aspect of music expression, but with this album, Transformational Variances, I very much also wanted to make a statement about the state of the world in terms of political polarization and in terms of the chaos of our time, because I think it's so important for people to recognize themselves individually and critique themselves before they critique the world. So I really wanted to make that statement, and there is a write-up that I did along with the album. That's one part of why I found it pressing to release the time I did. But I think most of what it honestly was that I had been working on it for so many hours for such a long time that I just needed to get it out of me and move on to do something else.
Right.
And
yeah, it's funny because people have different perspectives about releases. Some people treat it like it's a journal, so it's sort of like, well, I'm chucking this out because here's where I am at the time, right? Other people sort of like want to always make sure that what they're doing kind of represents the masterwork they always felt was in them or whatever. But I think that it's interesting to kind of consider what are the things that push work out the door. What's the instrumentation what is your primary instrument, and what was the tooling that you used to create this?
With this album, once I discovered audio signal processing using these Max tools like Music SDP and People, and discovering Soundflower and connecting the output of Mainstage with a bunch of Waves plugins bus to the signal to
right.
Reactor to Music SDP or Pool or something, I'm like, you could just clap and make it sound insane. Once I made that discovery, I remember the time, it was in my old house in Duluth, and I was in my room with one of my best friends, Cy, and we were just jamming, messing around, and I had a guitar loop going, and I was messing around with Mainstage with busing these plugins to the live signal, and then I finally figured out how to properly bus it, and then I turned up the distortion on the live signal,
right.
And I just got so stoked, and I did a backflip onto my bed. And I'm sure he remembers that too. But yeah, once I discovered that world, I was like, there is so much you can do. I don't try to focus on what instruments are made for or what they can specifically do, but rather turn that around and think about what they can't do and what they're not supposed to do. So often I will record guitar loops through a pedal board and send it through this processing chain, or going on a hike in Park Point and slamming sticks in this giant room with amazing acoustics, or accepting that I'm going to be an uncle, and how can I use my nephew's heartbeat to represent growth of the world and personal growth. Or I recently was in Norway and hiked up the side of this glacier at night, and I couldn't see anything, and I was like, what the hell am I supposed to do up here? I can't enjoy the massiveness of this glacier right now, even though I know where I am. So I took out my iPhone because I didn't have a Zoom at the time, and found these boulders and just kicked the boulders down the rock and watch it spark down the rock and then crash into the depth of the glacier. So in the dark, I listened to the depth of the glacier, and that made the experience really profound for me. And just it's a way, field recordings for me are a way of documenting my experiences and representing them in a more abstract way, in representing them in a way that maybe I would have unconsciously think about that situation or something. And so it's very much guitar loops, field recordings. I've used software synths and Logic a lot, and
It sounds like processing is more your instrument than almost any physical instrument.
Very much so. That's what it's turned into over time.
Now, one of the things is in a lot of cases where you're talking about real kind of profound moments, it seems like they're tied to hiking and being outdoors. And it's interesting that you say that, because I have to admit that in my life, there are a lot of situations where, like, when I've been in a place, the kind of like peak moments were a lot of times involved in hiking. There's something, whether it was I went to Hawaii, to the island of Kauai one time. We went on this hike and it was ridiculous. It was messy, clay-covered stuff, right, where you're walking right on the edge of the cliff and it seems like you could fall in any second, but and it was like ridiculously too long for what we should have been doing, but it didn't matter because we had a great time with it and it was a real peak experience. I remember so many of those things like viscerally. I remember how the clay felt under my feet, right? And I can remember this one section, the smell, and all of a sudden the smell of the ocean just kind of like overtook you and stuff. I mean, there's something about being outdoors, and particularly hiking, where you oftentimes run into real peak personal experiences. That's a case for you, that happens for you a lot.
Yeah, I absolutely think those outdoor experiences permeate that sort of disillusion of distraction and allow you to bring all of this unconscious content to the forefront and reflect on your life, especially when you're going out by yourself, because it's a grand gesture. It's a grand gesture not only to physically engage yourself, but to also mentally engage yourself. For me, that has always been a way to learn more about myself. It's very much, like you said, a peak experience of some sort, because you're dedicating this specific moment to the specific outcome of getting to the point where you want to get. But for me, it's more about the journey. It's about the walks. It's about the physicality of it. It's about the insights and realizations that I get along the way. I do think that is a great way to understand yourself, and I was lucky enough when I was living in Duluth to have easy access to the Spear hiking trail, so I did quite a bit of that, and a lot of times by myself, and I definitely learned a lot about what wasn't completely obvious when I was doing that.
Now, Duluth seems like, I want to dive into Duluth a little bit, because it actually seems like a very special place. Here in the U.S. Midwest, it kind of has, or there's this perception that, first of all, it's a damn cold place because it's pretty far north. But also, whether it's the university or the community, the artistic community, whatever, a lot of stuff seems to kind of vector out of Duluth in kind of an elemental way, right? There were a lot, like in the early days of Midwest raving and stuff, a lot of really important people kind of vectored out of the Duluth area. They have a real, or at least it seems from the outside, it seems like they have always had a kind of pretty vital punk scene going on up there. You yourself kicked off a music festival up there, kind of a experimental music fest, right? Is that true?
Yeah.
What is it about Duluth because it's a fairly tiny city, right?
Yeah, it's about 300,000 people in the metro area total.
Oh, that's actually more than I thought.
Including Hermantown and Superior.
Yeah, okay. All right. But still, it's a relatively small city for the amount of activity that seems to come out of there. What do you think is going on in Duluth that makes that happen?
Duluth is a blank canvas.
It doesn't bring any of its own stuff. Huh?
No. People who are there need to make it happen themselves, with the exception of something like Homegrown Music Festival, which gets all sorts of funding and has been around for over 20 years. But as far as what I've done or what other people have done up there that are somewhat peripheral, it's just a matter of getting creative and working with what you have. Like, I did a series of shows at the UMD Planetarium, and they were all for doing that. It really wasn't that hard to get in there. It was just about expressing the interest in sharing the idea. Or this old skate warehouse called the Carter, which the second edition of Northern Isolation was at, and they had this giant skate bowl, and it was like just a huge party pretty much. Or the past year at Northern Isolation, an art gallery called the 315 Gallery, and but really
Northern Isolation is the festival that you did. Right?
Correct. Yeah. But really, a big part of what I was involved in over my years up there was involved in the punk scene in Duluth. So I very much have a large background in that scene and the DIY music community in general. And when I was about 16 or so is when I started booking shows when I still lived down here in Minneapolis. And then once I moved up to Duluth for college, I wanted to see something like that happen. Freshman year, me and some friends would have some nights where, we'd try to find something that was going on. Classic freshman problem. In our case, we got super hammered off of Bacardi Limon and
nice.
And just just did whatever we could. We had a good floor. It was fun. At least I had a good time. Once we moved into a house, it all kind of congregated. There was all these weird people up there who wanted to see something happen. It was kind of like a case study. It was like there's all these individuals who are making weird music or have these interests, but they don't really have a manifestation for it. So I had connections from getting to know people over the years in various bands, and I've done quite a bit of traveling, so I've met a lot of people out of town that way. I just kept bugging them and was like, hey, come to Duluth, you'll have fun. And they always had fun.
That's
because
great.
Everyone just wanted to see something happen. And we had, an immense amount of house shows at a house that I lived at for 2 years with some good friends. And then a couple of my roommates at that house lived in another house the year before. So we had about 3 solid years of constant house shows and this whole separate DIY community that was bringing in a lot of interested people in Duluth.
So what is it? It's interesting to me the amount to which there is kind of a crossover, particularly from punk. I mean, you talk about DIY, which I guess is sort of a variant there, but it seems like that there's a crossover that then gets into experimentalism. Maybe it's vectored through like noise productions and stuff. I don't know. Why do you think that there's a connection between people that come up from a punk or a DIY background that eventually find themselves embracing electronics and experimentalism?
I think the ethos is universal, and I think the ethos lives through it all. If you had that sort of DIY ethos at some point growing up, I think that continues, at least for me, it has continued to manifest into how I approach a lot of my work, even if it's on in a more formal type of setting.
Sure.
I think there's a few reasons for that. One of them could be that music tastes grow over time. You may love what you used to hate or what you used to at least be confused about.
Not understand. Right,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or you may feel the opposite. You may completely have gotten over what you used to love. So I think music tastes change over time, and I think this type of music, like this abstract, endless type of work, is really attractive to people who want to keep pushing the boundaries and keep exploring different possibilities of making music. Once I got into this world, I started to discover artists like Tim Hecker and Ben Frost and Lawrence English, and I saw in them this boundless spirit, this kind of DIY spirit that was formally manifested through them with tons and tons of hard work. And I've always appreciated that about them, that they're taking this abstract peripheral work and presenting it in a way that matters to people. Not very many people can successfully do that, and I've really admired artists like that for that reason. At least the last few years, they've been a very big influence on me, not only because of the music itself, but because of the way they approach their work. All of them are much different, obviously, but in ways similar as well.
Sure. You talked a little bit about doing stuff using a mixture of tools, and that's kind of what the Music SDP thing is. You mentioned it briefly, and that was kind of one of the things we talked about when we were first going to get together. Can you explain really quickly what Music SDP represents?
The music and sound design platform. I would describe it as a type of digital modular synthesis. in terms of the board functionality. So it's all centered around the pedal board. So the same way you would connect a real guitar pedal board together, you can connect all of these different modules together, and there's over 60 now in the library. But you can do that in an infinite amount of ways. So it's kind of like a pedal board on steroids. It has a lot of other functionalities as well, but the program is centered around live performance and non-linear audio production. For example, you can have like a live signal being sent into an envelope module, then I'll send that into a delay, then maybe back into another envelope module, then maybe through a morphing filter or granular synthesis or something like that, back into another delay, and then create these feedback loops where there's constant perceived randomization happening because of different delay timings, and then you're processing the randomization and you're continuing to cycle through that randomization in a way that somehow containing chaos, you're seeing it happen even though you don't fully understand it. And you're watching the signal flow happen, you're hearing the signal flow happen without really understanding what's going on. And I really like that exploration. That's part of what really makes it exciting for me, both for production and live performance, is I can listen back to a stem from Transformational Variances and not really understand how it was created because it just happened at the time from some obscure jam or something.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because a lot of times I think, even though people talk about sort of like software modular tools, very seldom do we think of that, unless you're like one of the live coding people. Very seldom do we actually think about that as being a transformational thing during the performance, right? Mm-hmm. Just because, if nothing else, like the highly detailed movements with a mouse or whatever, kind of painful to try and do when you got like huge floods of adrenaline flowing through your system,
Yeah.
How do you combat that? How do you sort of like build a system that can kind of survive being that, right? I mean, because it's like, working with a modular system, an actual modular system live is plenty hard. It seems like it'd be even harder if like you had to get at it all by moving a mouse pointer, right?
That's the question, man. I mean, you set the feedback loop going and then you just do like 10 burpees or something. That's how you get out your physical prowess. No, it's tough, man. It's really tough because when you're behind the laptop screen, you're just not experiencing the show in the same way that the audience is experiencing it. So, going back to the DIY community, one of my favorite things about these house shows is that there's such an engagement between the audience and the crowd. It feels like it's all part of the same. So I really am trying to figure that out constantly. Like, how do I satisfy myself holistically and like existentially through working with this laptop screen, because it's not the same as playing drums in a punk band. It's a completely different approach. It's sometimes I have used live instruments and then like live, whether that's by myself or collaborating with others, and that's exciting because there's a physical element to it. But often, especially out of town shows, I've basically just used my laptop and sent all these different audio files through all these different modules, and I just kind of see it as, the march of progress can't be stopped, and this is a new way of doing things, right. And I'm just going to accept that and go with it and try to produce the best show I can for the audience, and accept the fact that you're never going to see your work the same way as the audience will see it. But it is an ultimate goal to try to unify those two as much as possible. So I think fulfilling your being in some way or another is very important. But I don't completely defend, the physicality of using instruments, the absolute necessity of, owning a $10,000 modular synth or something like that, because to me, you can do all of these amazing things with free open source software now, and that's how I like to work.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point. It seems like modular synth stuff, on one hand, it's really exciting and really fun and all that stuff, and at the other hand, it also can seem sometimes like a platform for consumers, right? It's like,
Yes.
who can buy the new cool thing that's going to make people show up to your show? Not because they want to hear your music, because they want to see you use the new groovy filter or weird digital sequencer or whatever. And it is kind of odd to think that that's the direction that it's all gone,
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of weird. So for yourself, do you ever use like MIDI controllers or anything, or are you always working just directly with the laptop?
I used to use a MIDI controller for older stuff, but I've never really dove into the world of MIDI a whole lot. Like I used one to record a lot of the software synths that were on Transformational Variances. But yeah, I don't really dive into the world of MIDI too much. I don't even know a whole lot about hardware. I've just never really taken the time
Just not
to
been into it.
understand a lot of it. I guess I've always thought of my approach more abstractly, and because I want to avoid exactly that, I don't want to fall into this consumerist culture because, well, I mean, we all do inevitably for one reason or another, but when it comes to music, like I very much see that as a spiritual thing, and I don't want it to cross over with this pretentious culture because,
Right.
well, part of it is, well, I'm trying to be more minimal in my life as well, and I like the idea of using minimal hardware. In this case, it would be a laptop with maximal output. I'm always stacking layers over one another and trying to create like this very thick gestalt that's like taking up a lot of space, but doing so without having the physical presentation of that necessarily.
One of the criticisms of working with a laptop, and one of the reasons a lot of people are moving to hardware, is because you can only have so much stuff, right? I mean, if you have a modular synth, at some point you are going to have all the oscillators that'll fit into it, right? Whether it's reactor or max or whatever, if you want to have 10,000 oscillators, you can probably pull it off. It's going to take a long time to put them on the screen,
Yeah.
but the fact of the matter is, you have almost no restraint or no reason to restrain yourself. So given that, I mean, you can really, I think a lot of people feel like they just kind of like flew off into the ether because they could have a million of everything. They started freaking out and adding a million of everything to everything, right? And all of a sudden the whole thing kind of goes in the toilet. And then they get something like, a little Dave Smith's instrument thing, and it's only got 2 oscillators, and now they're stuck with it, and it's almost freeing to have those kind of limits. But so you're a person who has really embraced the use of the laptop and its facility. What do you do to prevent yourself from just saying, wow, Waves just came out with another 72 plugins. I'm going to use them all. And Arturia just came out with another zillion synthesizer bundle. I'm going to use them all. Or there's, VCV Rack now has a million new modules. I'm going to use them all. How do you reel that back?
Well, I think that asks a bigger question of why do you own so much stuff? And why do we own so much stuff? Yeah, it's a pretty dismal question because, why do we have all these huge houses in the U.S.? Part of the reason is because the U.S. is huge and we have the room to do it. I think that's kind of the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, do we need this? I really like the 80-20 rule for, measuring the value of something because, well, what 20% of things do I have that I have
really vital,
produce 80% of the value in my life or something like that? And that's just a general rule, but I like the concept of it because how many of those plugins do you actually use? And how many of them actually sound good in your process? I think just adding something for the sake of adding it is completely superfluous and dismal to your own character.
That's actually a really great point because sometimes you can talk yourself into something being really good, even if it doesn't fit your style. And even if it's something that you're not going to use, you just talk yourself into it being cool because conceptually it's cool. And then having to attain that is kind of just a different version of the consumerist thing. You're doing it not because you need it or not because it's part of your artwork, but just because you somehow talked yourself into thinking of it as important. It sounds like you actually embrace the idea of being minimalist, even if it's inside of your laptop. what's the things that are your go-to things? What are your 20%?
Well, as far as how I live my life, or just the software that I use?
Yeah, well, just for the artistic work that you do. Yeah,
I would say the Zoom is one of them. The field recorder, that's a very important tool. These software tools like Mainstage, Music SDP, things like that. My guitar, pedal board. The more I've worked with just, I guess, plain audio files and not as much MIDI, I've kind of limited myself to a few things that I consciously choose to try to get better at, and that I realize are tools that have many different possibilities within the same thing. Yeah, it's kind of like whatever presents itself as something that I find meaningful, or that I find to be a blank canvas where the answers aren't already set out for me. And I think that's part of the reason why I've avoided, a lot of hardware, which I actually recently bought a Nord Modular that I need to learn. So
Okay.
that's going to be a whole new world. But
yeah. Well, hardware does tend to make you go follow its path rather than you doing your path on it.
yes, and I think that's what I was alluding to at the end of the day. Is it's not necessarily the external solution that brings in the internal creativity. It's the other way around. So I think you figure that out within yourself first, and well, at least for me, that produces the outcomes that I want to produce.
Now, talking just really quickly about the Music SDP stuff, are you part of the development group on that?
I don't code in Max. The lead developer has gone over the basics with me, so I have a little bit of an understanding of it. But I think of a lot of ideas in ways that modules can be improved.
I see.
I test out the software with my own music. I do graphic design for the software, and I help them with marketing. So I'm more of kind of a conceptual backbone,
Got it.
if anything.
Sure. Okay, cool. That's really interesting. It's nice to have that role being filled too. For I know as a software developer, sometimes it can be a little daunting to have to try and self-critique. So having people that are using the thing, being willing to help out is a big asset as well. Well, Dean, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for spending the time talking. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks, Darwin.
Sure. Many thanks to Dean for having the chat. Thanks to you for tuning in again and listening. Really appreciate everybody's continued involvement in the podcast. It really makes it pretty special. We will catch you again next week. Thanks a lot and have a good one. Bye.